It was past midnight when Michael Brooks realized he wasn't alone in the factory. The machines were supposed to be silent, the building locked and empty. But from deep in the assembly line came the sound of metal crashing, drills firing, and voices whispering in the dark. When he turned the corner, he saw them. An entire crew of workers, gray-faced, hollow-eyed, moving as if they had been working there for years. Only these workers were dead. And when they noticed Michael, every single head turned in unison. "Join us," they whispered. "Join us." One of them, tall and broad, stepped forward. Its voice was like metal grinding against metal. "Brooks, you're late for your shift." Michael froze. He wanted to run, but the exits were locked. The workers began gliding toward him, chanting louder. "Company policy. Everyone joins eventually." And that was when Michael understood. This wasn't just a factory. It was a prison for the dead. And if he stayed any longer, it would claim him too. But to understand how he ended up here, and why the shadows of Cleveland Industrial wanted him, we have to go back 6 months earlier. The fluorescent light above the security desk flickered with a dying gasp, casting dancing shadows across the empty factory floor. Michael Brooks rubbed his burning eyes and checked the time, 2:47 a.m. Another 6 hours until his shift ended, another day of pretending he could hold this all together. 6 months ago, Michael thought his biggest problem was working night security at Cleveland Industrial Manufacturing. Now he knew there were far worse things than loneliness and boredom in the dark. 6 months ago, his wife Jennifer died in a car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light, took her from their children and him in an instant. Lily was 5, still asked when Mommy was coming home. Lucas was only 18 months old. He would never remember her voice, her laugh, the way she used to sing him to sleep. The life insurance barely covered the funeral. Jennifer's sister, Rebecca, had been watching the kids during Michael's night shifts, but he could see the strain in her eyes. She had her own family, her own problems. He dropped Lily off at kindergarten each morning after his shift, then tried to care for Lucas on 3 hours of sleep while fighting to keep the utilities on. This job paid just enough to keep them afloat. Barely. Cleveland Industrial Manufacturing produced automotive parts, running 3 shifts Monday through Friday. Michael's job was simple. Walk the perimeter, check the locks, make sure nobody broke in to steal copper wire or machinery. The plant shut down at 11 p.m. sharp, and by midnight the building should be empty except for him. That's how it was supposed to work. The first time Michael heard the machines running, he thought he'd misunderstood the schedule. It was his 3rd week on the job, around 1 a.m., when the distinctive whir of the production line started up from somewhere deep in the factory. The sound echoed through the empty corridors like mechanical screams. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the noise, keys jangling against his belt. The main production floor stretched out in front of him, a maze of conveyor belts, stamping machines, and welding stations. Everything was dark, everything was still. But the sound continued. Michael followed it deeper into the facility, past the break room where someone had left a coffee mug on the table, past the supervisor's office with its door hanging slightly ajar. The mechanical noise grew louder, more insistent, coming from the far end of the building where the heavy machinery was housed. When he reached the source, everything was silent. The massive stamping press that formed fender panels stood motionless, its emergency stop button engaged. The conveyor belt that should have been humming with activity was frozen mid-cycle. Michael checked every machine, every switch, every power source. Nothing was running. But he had heard it, clear as day. He reported it to his supervisor the next morning. Dave Wilson had been with Cleveland Industrial for 15 years, a no-nonsense guy who didn't appreciate false alarms. "You sure you weren't hearing the HVAC system?" Dave asked, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Sometimes the air handlers kick on during the night cycle." Michael knew the difference between air conditioning and industrial machinery, but he nodded and let it go. He needed this job. The sounds came back the following week. This time it wasn't just the stamping press. Michael heard the welding torches firing, the pneumatic drills cycling, even the forklift beeping as it backed up. When he investigated, the welding stations were cold, the drill bits were secured in their holders, and the forklift was... Michael started making detailed notes. Times, locations, durations. Maybe there was a pattern he could figure out, some logical explanation that would make sense of what he was experiencing. The stress of losing Jennifer, the exhaustion from single parenthood, the financial pressure. Maybe it was all catching up with him, but the notes only made it worse. The phantom sounds weren't random. They were getting longer, more frequent, more complex. It was as if an entire shift of workers was operating in a parallel version of the factory, invisible to his eyes but perfectly audible to his ears. Then Michael started seeing the lights. It happened on a Thursday night in his second month. He was doing his 3 a.m. perimeter check when he noticed a warm glow coming from the welding bay. As he approached, he could see the distinctive blue-white flashes of arc welding reflecting off the walls and ceiling. His heart hammered as he crept closer. Someone was definitely in there, working on something. An unauthorized person in the facility would cost him his job, but it would also mean he wasn't losing his mind. Michael peered around the corner, flashlight ready, expecting to confront an intruder. The welding bay was empty, dark, cold. But as he stepped into the space, the smell hit him. That distinctive metallic scent of hot steel and burning flux. The air still shimmered with heat waves. On the workbench, a piece of raw steel sat clamped in a vise, and he could see fresh weld marks along its edge, the metal still glowing faint orange. He touched it with the tip of his finger and jerked back with a curse. It was scalding hot. Someone had been there. Someone was welding. But where did they go? There was only one entrance to the bay, and he'd been watching it the entire time. Michael searched every corner, every hiding spot, every possible exit. Nothing. He was alone with a piece of freshly welded steel that shouldn't exist. That's when he heard the laughter. It came from somewhere behind him, low and raspy, like someone trying to chuckle through a throat full of gravel. Michael spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. The laughter came again, closer this time. Then voices, multiple voices, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. The sounds seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the machinery, from the very air around him. Michael ran. He wasn't proud of it, but he ran straight back to his security desk and spent the rest of the shift with his back to the wall, watching every shadow, listening to every sound. When Dave Wilson asked him the next morning if anything unusual had happened, Michael lied. What was he supposed to say? That he'd witnessed invisible welders and heard phantom laughter? That the factory was haunted by the ghosts of workers who'd never existed? He needed the job. Lily needed new shoes. Lucas needed formula. The rent was due in a week, so he said nothing, and the nightmares got worse. By his third month, Michael wasn't just hearing and seeing things, he was encountering them. Shadowy figures that moved through the machinery like smoke. Faces that appeared in the reflection of turned-off computer monitors. Hands that left grimy fingerprints on surfaces he'd just cleaned. The workers, as he'd begun thinking of them, seemed to operate on their own schedule. They'd arrive sometime after midnight and work until dawn, invisible but undeniably present. Michael learned to avoid certain areas during their peak hours, staying in his office or limiting his patrols to the administrative wing. But they were getting bolder, more solid, more real. One night in early November, Michael was walking past the break room when he heard the unmistakable sound of a conversation. Multiple voices, casual and relaxed, the kind of workplace banter you'd hear during any normal shift break. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. Told him the quotas were impossible, but does management listen? Never do. That's why I stopped trying years ago. Smart man. Just put in your hours and go home. Speaking of which, break's over. Back to the grind. Michael heard chairs scraping, footsteps, the sound of people dispersing. Then silence. He opened the door. The break room was empty, but the air was thick with cigarette smoke, despite the factory's strict no-smoking policy. On the table sat 3 coffee mugs, still steaming. A newspaper was folded open to the sports section, and someone had been working on the crossword puzzle. The writing was fresh, the ink still wet. Michael picked up one of the mugs and nearly dropped it. It was warm, full of black coffee that smelled like it had just been brewed. But the coffee machine was unplugged. Had been unplugged for months, according to the day shift supervisor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty room. "I know you're here. I can see your coffee." No response. He tried a different approach. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble. I just need to understand what's happening here." Still nothing. But as he turned to leave, Michael heard a whisper, soft and urgent. "He can see us." Then another voice. "Not supposed to see us." A third. "Been watching too long." The voices were coming from right behind him, so close he could feel breath on his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there except empty air and the lingering smell of tobacco. That's when Michael made his first real mistake. He tried to tell someone. Rebecca was picking up Lily and Lucas when he got home the next morning. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "You look like hell, Mike," she said, settling Lucas into his car seat. "When's the last time you got a full night's sleep?" "It's not the sleep," Michael said. "It's the job." "No, there's something wrong with that place." He told her everything. The sounds, the lights, the phantom workers who left behind physical evidence of their presence. Rebecca listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a mental patient. "Stress can do funny things to your mind," she said gently. "You've been through a lot. Maybe you should talk to someone." "I'm not hallucinating," Michael insisted. "I have proof." There were coffee mugs, still warm, fresh welding marks, fingerprints. Rebecca's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Mike, you need help. Real help. The kids need you stable." The implication was clear. If he kept talking about invisible factory workers, she'd question his fitness as a father. He couldn't risk that. Lily and Lucas were all he had left. So Michael stopped talking about it. But the encounters continued. November became December, and the phantom shift grew more aggressive. They no longer seemed content to ignore him. He'd find tools moved from where he'd left them, safety equipment tampered with, his security logs altered in handwriting that wasn't his. One particularly cold night, Michael arrived for his shift to find every light in the facility turned on. The factory blazed like a beacon in the industrial district, visible from miles away. But when he entered the building, the switches were all in the off position, and the electrical meters showed no unusual power consumption. He spent an hour turning off lights that shouldn't have been on, all while listening to the sound of machinery running just out of sight. No matter which direction he turned, the noise always seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere he'd just left or hadn't yet reached. Then Michael found the message. It was written in grease pencil on the supervisor's whiteboard, in handwriting he'd never seen before. Time to join the crew. Below it, someone had drawn a crude map of the factory floor with an X marking the spot where the main assembly line began. At the bottom, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Midnight tomorrow. Don't be late." Michael erased the message immediately, but he couldn't erase the cold dread that settled in his stomach. Whatever was happening in this place, it had noticed him, and it wanted something. He considered quitting, walking away from the job, the mystery, the increasingly hostile presence that seemed to grow stronger each night. But Michael couldn't afford to quit. He had exactly $47 in his checking account. Rent was due in 3 days, and Lucas needed prescription medicine for an ear infection. He was trapped by necessity and growing more terrified by the hour. The next night, Michael arrived at work with a plan. He'd brought his phone to record video, a digital camera to take pictures, and a small voice recorder to capture audio evidence. If he was going insane, at least he'd have documentation. If he wasn't, maybe he could figure out what was really happening. The factory felt different the moment he walked in. The air was thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound seemed amplified. Every reflection in the darkened windows seemed to show movement where there should be none. Michael made his way to the assembly line, following the crude map from the erased message. As he approached the designated spot, he could hear them gathering. Footsteps, voices, the rustle of work clothes, and the clink of tools being prepared. At exactly midnight they appeared. Not gradually, not as shifting shadows or half-glimpsed figures, but all at once, like someone had suddenly turned on the lights in a room full of people. A complete crew of factory workers materialized around the assembly line, as solid and real as anything Michael had ever seen. But they were wrong. Fundamentally, horribly wrong. Their skin had a grayish pallor, like old meat left too long in the sun. Their clothes were stained with substances that might have been oil or might have been something far worse. And their eyes were black voids that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with mechanical precision, performing tasks that made no sense. One worker repeatedly hammered a piece of steel that wasn't there. Another operated a welding torch with no metal to weld, the flame casting impossible shadows that moved independently of its source. A third fed non-existent parts into a machine that consumed them with wet, organic sounds. But the worst part was their faces. When they turned to look at Michael, and they were all looking at him now, their expressions were grotesque parodies of human emotion, smiles that stretched too wide, showing teeth filed to points, eyes that tracked his movement with predatory intelligence. One of them, a tall figure in a supervisor's shirt that might once have been white, stepped forward. "Brooks," it said, and its voice was like metal grinding against metal. "You're late for your shift." "I don't work this shift," Michael managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "You do now," another one said, this one shorter and broader, with arms that seemed too long for its body. "Company policy. Everyone joins eventually." "Join us," they began to chant in unison. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" They started moving toward him, not walking, but gliding, their feet making no sound on the concrete floor. Michael backed away, fumbling for his phone, trying to start the video recording with hands that shook uncontrollably. "I need to go," he said. "My children are waiting." The tall one laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Children don't wait for the dead." That's when Michael understood. These weren't ghosts or hallucinations or stress-induced visions. These were something far worse. They were workers who had never left, employees who had clocked in for a shift that would never end. And they wanted him to join them. Michael ran. He dropped his phone, forgot about the cameras and recording equipment, and ran for the exit like his life depended on it. Behind him, their laughter echoed through the facility, growing louder and more inhuman with each step he took. But the doors wouldn't open. Michael pulled, pushed, tried every exit he could find. They were all locked from the inside, sealed with mechanisms that didn't exist during the day. He was trapped in the factory with creatures that wanted to make him one of them. "There's no leaving," the tall one said. It had somehow gotten ahead of him, blocking the main entrance with its impossible presence. Company policy? The others emerged from the shadows, surrounding Michael with their dead eyes and pointed teeth. Up close, he could see that their bodies bore the marks of industrial accidents, missing fingers, burn scars, gouges where machinery had taken its toll. These weren't just dead workers. These were workers who had died on the job, and somehow the factory had kept their souls as eternal employees. "Please," Michael begged. "I have children. They need me." "The company needs you more," the short one said. "Production quotas must be met." They reached for him with hands that felt like cold metal, and Michael knew that if they touched him, he would become like them, another phantom worker, trapped in an endless night shift in a factory that existed somewhere between the living world and whatever came after. That's when he heard the voice. Michael Brooks. It came from behind the crowd of dead workers, calm and authoritative. They turned toward the sound, their formations shifting to reveal a figure Michael hadn't seen before. It was a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a Cleveland PD uniform that looked somehow more real than everything else in this nightmare. His badge caught the overhead lights, reflecting them back with a brilliance that made Michael squint. "Officer," Michael started to say, but the man held up a hand. "You don't belong here," he said to the creatures. "This man has obligations to the living." The tall worker's face contorted with rage. "Company policy supersedes local jurisdiction." "Not tonight," the officer said. He looked at Michael with eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Tell me about your son's elephant." Michael stared at him in confusion. "What elephant?" "The little gray one," the officer said gently. "The one your wife bought him. The one he carries everywhere, sleeps with every night. The one he's been crying for because he can't find his daddy." Michael's heart stopped. How could this stranger know about Lucas's favorite toy? About Jennifer buying it? About how Lucas cried when he wasn't there? How do you know about that?" he whispered. "Because love leaves traces," the officer said. "And your love for those children is stronger than any force trying to claim you. Hold on to that love. Use it. Show them what it looks like." Michael thought about Lucas's laugh, his first steps, the way he reached for him when he was scared. He thought about his little elephant that Jennifer had bought him, about how he carried it everywhere and slept with it every night. He thought about Lily asking when Mommy was coming home, about tucking her in at night and reading her stories about brave princesses and kind dragons. Light began to emanate from his hands as he focused on that love, not bright, but steady, like a candle flame that refused to be extinguished. The dead workers screamed and scattered, their forms dissolving like smoke in a strong wind. "No!" the tall one shrieked. "Company policy. Production quotas." But their voices were already fading, becoming echoes, becoming memory. Within moments, Michael was alone in the factory with the police officer, his hands still glowing faintly with the power of a father's desperate love. "Thank you," Michael said, looking up at the officer. "I don't know how to—" But the man was already walking away, his figure becoming indistinct in the shadows. "Wait!" Michael called after him. "What's your name? How do I find you?" His voice drifted back, already faint. "You don't need to find me. I'll find you when you need me most." And then he was gone, leaving Michael alone with the memory of his words and the lingering smell of something like cinnamon and sunshine. The factory doors opened easily now. Michael walked out into the cold December air, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in months. The phantom workers were gone, their supernatural shift finally ended. He could feel it in the building's silence, in the way the shadows fell naturally, in the absence of that oppressive weight that had been crushing him for so long. He went home and hugged his children. Rebecca was asleep on the couch, exhausted from another night of babysitting, but she stirred when he entered. "How was work?" she asked sleepily. "Quiet," Michael said, which was now true. Very quiet. Lucas was in his crib, clutching his little elephant and sleeping peacefully. When he saw Michael, his whole face lit up with joy. He babbled something that might have been "daddy," or might have been "thank you," or might have been "I missed you." The next morning, Michael called the Cleveland Police Department to thank the officer who had helped him. He described him as best he could: tall, broad-shouldered, kind eyes, badge number that he thought he remembered. "I'm sorry, sir," the desk sergeant said after checking their records. "We don't have anyone matching that description, and we didn't have any units in that area last night." Michael tried again, thinking maybe he'd called the wrong precinct. Same result. He drove to the station in person, asked to speak with the supervisor, described the officer in detail. They were polite but firm. No such person worked for Cleveland PD, but Michael knew what he saw. He knew who saved him. The factory has been quiet ever since. No phantom sounds, no mysterious lights, no messages written in grease pencil. It's just a building now, filled with machinery that only runs when real workers operate it during real shifts. Michael still works the night security job, but he's looking for something else, something with daylight hours and living colleagues. Rebecca has offered to help with the kids during the transition, and for the first time since Jennifer died, he feels like maybe they'll be okay. Sometimes, late at night during his rounds, he thinks he catches a glimpse of that police officer watching over the facility. Never close enough to speak to, never clear enough to be certain, but always there when he feels that old anxiety creeping back. Whoever he was, wherever he came from, he knew exactly what Michael needed to remember: that love is stronger than death, that the living have obligations that trump any supernatural demands, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness is a father's desperate love for his children. Michael still thinks about that night during his shifts, about how close he came to losing everything. Not because he expects to encounter any more dead workers, but because it reminds him what he's working for, what he's living for. And sometimes, just sometimes, he swears he can smell cinnamon and sunshine in the midnight air.